Okay, this talk is about the polygrammaticalization of the sequential medial verb marker ulug in Yali. Very briefly, Yali is a Dani language of the Trans-New Guinea family, spoken in the highlands of West Papua in Indonesia. And strictly speaking, we are actually not really talking about the grammaticalization of the suffix, but rather of three highly frequent verbs that occur with this marker. And that is the medial verb form of the verb to see, which becomes a conditional marker of the verb for to take, which ends up in a complex predicate, and of the verb for to say, which develops into an epistemic marker. But before we start looking at medial verbs, let's just very briefly look at non-medial verbs. So let's look at an independent clause in Yali. An independent clause in Yali has a finite predicate in final position. And that does not necessarily have to be a simplex verb. It can be a multi-verb predicate, as it is the case here, because it's progressive, for example. That's not important. What is important is that this final verb form is inflected for tense and for person and number of the subject referent. What is also important for the letter argument is that these final verb forms usually come with a specific prosodic contour, namely a quite pronounced final fall. And I play that for you. You see it also in the pitch curve here. Okay, so let's turn to medial verbs. Medial verbs occur in medial clauses, and medial clauses occur in clause chains. And a Yali clause chain could look like that. You have a finite clause in final position, which is called the final clause, and that might be preceded by either one or more medial clauses. Importantly, only the final verb in the final clause is fully inflected for tense and subject agreement, and the medial verbs inherit tense and possibly also aspect mood values from the final verb. And furthermore, the medial verb marker, and that's in this case ulug, signals a temporal and referential relationship between the clauses. So in this case, that is sequentiality and same subjecthood. Here's a real Yali example of such a clause chain. You see two medial verb forms. In the first clause, isak salog, and in the second clause, wat salog. And then you have the final verb in the final clause, wilibapak. So after Tenghe was cooked by the people from the east and Temhe was killed by the people from the west, they went out. I'll play that for you.
Tanghet no, Yali filen isak saluk, eke mele dempet no, kubila filen wat saluk, wilibapak.
So looking at the pitch again, we see this very nice pronounced fall on the final verb. And we also see on the medial verb here in the first clause, a very nice and high rise. We don't see that that nicely in the second case of wat salog, but we also clearly don't see the final fall here. And what's more, all three clauses are quite nicely separated by quite long pauses. I play it again.
Tanghet no, Yali filen isak saluk, eke mele dempet no, kubila filen wat saluk, wilibapak.
Okay. Now let's turn to our case studies. So we promised that we show that the medial verb form of the verb see, halog, develops into a conditional marker connecting two finite clauses that then reads as if clause 1, then clause 2. That the medial verb form of take combines a motion, combines with a motion verb and develops into a complex predicate where the two verbs together map their argument structure onto a monoclausal syntactic structure. And finally, that the medial verb form for say or look via insubordination ends up in final sentence position and there functions as an epistemic marker. Now, for reasons of time, we can actually only talk about two of these case studies, and we decided to talk about the second and the third. So let's start with walug, becoming part of a complex predicate. So walug as an independent final verb is actually a caused motion verb, which means that it means something like take in the sense of get or obtain, where the agent is the natural endpoint of the movement of the theme, but the agent does not move him or herself. Here's an example. Where did you get this Halle wood? And here in 5, you have an example of that same basic meaning of waruk, this time as a medial verb in a clause chain. She took the remains of his blood and pouched it and wrapped it into a tahi cocoon. And I'll play that for you. Okay. Again, like in the first clause chain that I showed you, we have this nice high rise here on the medial verb walukte, and we have that fall on the final verb in the final clause. Once more. Okay, now when waluk combines with a motion verb, then this complex together expresses a caused accompanied motion event. And that means that this time the agent moves in a direction and causes a theme to move along the same path. So as I said, most frequently, waluk here combines with go or come, but it can also combine with non-deictic directed motion verbs such as ascend, descend, enter, or go out. And we argue that in most of these cases, this combination of medial take plus motion verb functions as a complex predicate rather than a clause chain. Here you have two examples. In A, waluk is followed by the verb for go, and then the motion denotes motion away from the deictic center. And in B, waluk is followed by the verb for to come, and then that motion would be towards the deictic center. So in A, his friends took it away. In B, the girls, they brought for. Let's listen to that.
Orion wal asa.
Okay, and you will probably have noted this time that the medial verb form and the final verb are less separated really, and that the medial verb form waluk is a little bit closer integrated to the following material. Let's listen to that again.
Orion wal asa.
Further evidence that these expressions form a tighter unit than the clause chains is that in our corpus, in 91% of all cases, waluk is directly followed by a motion predicate. And only in 23 instances, there is other material following. And you saw one of these examples earlier. Further evidence comes from the scope of negation, the actual choice of the connector, and the scope of the goal phrase. And we don't really have the time to discuss that all in detail, but I want to show you one example that illustrates the latter point. that is the scope of the goal phrase. So here 7a and 7b are two consecutive sentences in a narrative. And they're actually also a very nice example of a tail-head linkage construction where parts of the first sentence in 7a are then taken up in the second sentence again in 7b. I play it for you. Okay, and note the important point here is that the goal phrase, "wig mu with no," in 7a comes after the medial verb, and this structure then displays a normal prototypical clause chain structure. Sorry. So they took the baked pig fat and went to the cave. In 7b, on the other hand, this goal phrase comes before the medial verb, right? But it is still interpreted as a goal, like a goal phrase, basically. So, and we take that as evidence that walug liberag here already forms a complex predicate, because if 7b was still a chaining construction, then owig mu would have to be interpreted as having a stative locative meaning, right? Then that sentence would translate as they took it in the cave and then they went. But that's not what the sentence means. Both sentences, A and B, describe the same event, namely that they took the pig fat to the cave. So this example actually nicely shows that the chaining construction is continued and coexists together with the complex predicate structure. Now, let's turn to our second case study and the verb ulug, say, and let's see how and why this medial verb form became an epistemic marker and how it ended up in this sentence final position there. So as a final verb, ulug means say or speak or talk, something like that. And here you have an example. Kitiare papahenuktot imihin. So first you will say your name. Here's an example as ulug as a medial verb in a clause chain. They agreed and waited, or more literally, that would translate as after saying yes, they stayed. And actually all occurrences of ulug in a clause chain in our corpus mark direct quoted speech, which is also known as inner speech, for example, or quotative framing. And of course, you all know that that is a very widespread phenomenon amongst the Papuan languages. Here's a quote from De Vries, 2013. Papuan speakers strongly prefer to use the frame of reported conversation with didactically semi-direct quotation clauses with quote marking morphology and or verbs of speaking, not only to report speech acts, but also to talk about many other domains, including intention, cognition, emotion, perception, and indirect causation. Here's another example of a quoted speech act in Yali. They told him to stay and watch the house, left him and went. Or, more literally, after saying, you stay and watch the house, they left him and went. And I play it. Okay. So syntactically, this looks pretty much like a prototypical clause chain. But prosodically, it seems to be the case that the speech verb, walug, becomes detached from the reported speech and more integrated with the following material. So let's look at that again and let's play it again.
Hata oyaka wala mo ulok tem se lok le bak.
So that seems to be a break, a prosodic break between Wilat Muk and Olukte. Now, Ulug can also be directly followed by an additional verb of uruk, say, or a cognition verb like, for example, peruk, think, or the light verb suruk, do. And here we have two examples. One is, again, a reported speech act. The other one is an intentional structure. So the first one, they told him to bring pandanus from that area, or more literally, you bring pandanus from that area, Uluk, they said. And the second one, they wanted to go and eat, or literally, we will go and eat, Uluk, they said. Let's listen to it.
Du fikir det sagwa klar lo ba.
Okay.
Na lao ko lok e ba.
So in these cases, we would argue that uluk is also syntactically closer to the following final verb, though we are not really sure about how to properly analyze that. So are these also complex predicates, or would it maybe make more sense to say that uluk here has developed into a quotative particle or something like that? We don't know. But what seems to be the case is that from this structure now, via insubordination, uluk ends up in sentence final position and gains an epistemic stance marking function. Here's an example of that. Maybe the devil entered and slept amongst us. So here now, uluk stands at the very end of the clause and seems to be marking that this is the speaker's opinion and that he's actually maybe not certain about whether that statement is true. So let's listen.
Mungkar ki ko arah ni tinaklaman oru ko lok.
Okay, and let's also look at that. Obviously, one could imagine that there is another verb of saying or thinking following uluk, and then it would be just like the examples before. I think that the devil has entered and slept amongst us, but it's not the case. And here you see that uluk also gets this final intonation contour. Once more.
Mungkar ki ko arah ni tinaklaman oru ko lok.
Okay. So one final question that we want to raise is, why is it only forms with log that gain new functions? Because log is actually not the only medial and or switch reference marker in Yali. There is another pair, lit and im, which mark simultaneous actions, same subject and different subject, and another pair that marks sequential actions, same subject, different subjects. And they attach to or follow different verb forms. So lit and im attach to or follow infinitive forms, and turk and mu attach to fully inflected forms. So these are actually not medial verb form markers, but switch reference markers. And only log really attaches directly to the verb root. So we have a hypothesis why it might be only log, and it has to do with frequency. We don't have the time to go into detail here and discuss it. We would be very happy to hear your opinion about that in the discussion. So I will just very briefly summarize. We have been talking about the grammaticalization of walug and ulug, two medial verb forms in Yali. Many issues of the analysis, both syntactically and prosodically, still need to be researched in more detail. But what we could show is that former medial verb forms no longer occur in their original position at the end of medial verb clauses. And they also lose their medial prosodic contour and attach more tightly to the following material, or even receive a sentence final contour, as it was in the case of ulug. We also showed that new uses coexist with the source constructions, and we would hypothesize that the grammaticalization process is possibly not completed yet. And again, here we would be very happy to hear your opinion, and especially also to hear whether you've seen something similar in the languages you are working on. So I want to say thank you to Katharina Geiler for producing the F0 extractions with Pratt. And my very special thanks also goes to the Yali speakers who have worked with us and helped us. And I especially want to mention Saul Walyangen, Silpa Wandik, Lin Shefaluk, Isaac Wandik, and Martin Walyangen. Thank you very much.